The storm had been building all day, a gray weight pressing low upon the hills, until by dusk the world outside Aurelia Whitfield's cabin was a whirling blindness of white. Snow piled against the warped boards of her roof, heavy as judgment, and every gust of wind moaned against the chimney like the cry of something old and wounded. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and thin soup, the warmth just enough to keep the walls from freezing over. Aurelia crouched near the hearth, her skirts spread around her like a faded sun, and poked at the embers with a trembling hand. The fire flared, then shrank again, reminding her of her own life, momentary sparks swallowed by the dark. She had lived alone for 5 winters now. Long enough for the town to stop asking after her, long enough for whispers to replace sympathy. They said she was cursed, that any man who stepped near her door would meet bad ends, and perhaps they were right. Her husband had vanished into the snows the second winter, gone hunting elk and never returning. The one neighbor who once offered her a ride to church drowned when his wagon tipped in the icy river. Even the traveling preacher who left her a loaf of bread had been struck with fever before spring. The town's tongues clucked and wagged, and the weight of their words clung heavier than any snow. She bore it in silence, her beauty preserved but shadowed, like a candle hidden behind frosted glass. The storm rattled the shutters, and Aurelia rose to fasten them tighter. Her breath fogged in the room. She pressed her palm against the wooden frame and thought of voices, laughter once filling this cabin, footsteps across the floor, warmth that wasn't just firelight. Now there was only the hush of snow and the loneliness that pressed close as skin. She had become used to silence, yet sometimes it roared louder than thunder. Tonight it wrapped around her like a burial shroud. Her food stores were low. The pot on the hearth held nothing more than thin broth flavored with a cracked bone. She dipped a ladle, tasted, and let it slide back, unswallowed. Hunger had become a steady ache, one she treated as she did the town's judgment, ignored until it threatened to fell her. When she glanced at the woodpile, the sight drew another hollow into her chest. Just a few logs remained. She would need more to last the night, and though the storm had grown merciless, she tied a shawl tight around her head and pushed open the door. The wind struck her like a living thing. Snowflakes whipped against her cheeks, clinging to her lashes, numbing her fingers before she had crossed the yard. She lifted the hatchet and set it against a waiting log. The blow landed weakly. Her arms had grown thin from years of half-meals and lonely labor. She tried again, teeth clenched, breath rising in clouds. The wood split uneven, and she bent to gather the pieces, vision swimming. When she straightened, the storm swirled around her, blotting out even the outline of the cabin. She swayed, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. A wave of exhaustion poured through her like floodwater. The world dimmed, then brightened, then tilted. She dropped the wood and fell to her knees in the snow. For a moment she thought of her mother's voice, soft as church bells, telling her that dignity was in how one bore suffering. Aurelia whispered a prayer, words stolen by the wind. She pressed her palms against the drift, trying to push herself upright, but her strength fled. The snow was softer than she had imagined, almost tender against her skin. She let herself lean into it, eyelids heavy. A sound carried through the storm then, boots crunching on the frozen ground. At first she thought it memory, her husband returning at last, but the cadence was different. Heavier, slower, deliberate. Another set followed, lighter but steadier, as though echoing the first. Aurelia forced her eyes open. Shapes moved in the storm, blurred shadows that grew clearer as they neared. One was massive, broad-shouldered, a dark silhouette against the pale whirling snow. The other leaned slightly, the posture of age rather than weakness, steps careful but unwavering. They came toward her cabin, as though the storm were nothing but shallow water. Aurelia's breath snagged in her throat. Fear pricked at her, yet her body refused to rise. The figures loomed closer, and with each step the truth sharpened. Not settlers. Not neighbors. Men of another world, their long hair heavy with frost, their presence vast and unyielding. The larger one was bare-chested despite the cold, skin marked with lines of muscle that shone like bronze beneath drifting snow. The elder wore a heavy hide draped across his shoulders, his face carved with the stillness of stone. They did not hurry, yet the storm seemed to part around them, as if even the wind made way. Aurelia pressed her palm to the snow, trying once more to lift herself. The younger man reached her first. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but not cruel. He knelt, steam rising from his skin, and slid his arms beneath her with a gentleness that jarred her heart. She wanted to protest, to demand who he was, but her lips formed no sound. He lifted her as though she weighed no more than a child, cradling her against his chest. She felt the heat of him, startling in the frozen night, and the rhythm of his breath steady against her ear. The elder man approached, studying her with eyes that glowed like embers in the storm's half-light. He said something in a tongue she did not know, words slow and grave, and the younger one answered with a nod. They turned toward her cabin, carrying her with them, as though it had been decided long before. Aurelia closed her eyes, fear and faint relief twining inside her. No one had touched her in years. No one had come for her in all her winters alone. Now strangers bore her across the snow with a certainty that made her chest ache. The cabin's door creaked open, and warmth brushed her face. She stirred weakly, trying to find her voice, to ask why they had come. But the storm howled louder, rattling the roof as if to drive her question away. The younger man set her near the hearth, and the elder drew the blanket over her shoulders. Their shadows filled the cabin, vast and alien, yet for the first time in years, the silence of the room was broken. Aurelia sat trembling, caught between fear and something dangerously close to hope. Outside, the storm roared on. Inside, the sound of boots on her wooden floor was the promise of a story she had not asked for, but could no longer escape. Aurelia woke to the hiss of the fire, and the unfamiliar weight of voices murmuring low in her cabin. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, until she opened her eyes and saw them. Two figures, shadows moving against the lantern light. The younger one knelt by the hearth, feeding the flames with wood that had not been there before, his wide shoulders bare, skin glistening faintly with thawed snow. The elder sat nearby, posture straight despite the heaviness of his years, eyes glinting like polished stone as he watched the room with measured calm. Her breath caught. She sat upright, pulling the blanket close as if it were armor. The men turned toward her with quiet acknowledgment but no startlement, as though her sudden motion had been expected. The elder inclined his head slowly, a gesture more solemn than polite, and spoke in a voice low and grave. The words were foreign, shaped in a tongue she did not know, yet their cadence carried weight that felt older than the storm itself. The younger answered him briefly, then looked back at her. Their gazes met, and Aurelia's chest tightened. His eyes were dark, steady, unyielding yet not cruel. She saw strength there, but also something quieter, like patience carved from stone. He did not reach for her, did not speak, only regarded her as though weighing whether she could withstand the storm inside herself. Her throat ached with dryness. "Why are you here?" she whispered, the words trembling. Neither man answered at first. The elder lifted his chin toward the broken shutter, rattling against the wind, and Aurelia realized the storm had worsened through the night. The snow pressed against the doorframe, seeping through cracks like sand through a sieve. They had not come to threaten her. They had come because the storm would not be faced alone. Still, shame burned hot in her chest. She thought of the town and its whispers, the cruel edge of their judgment. What would they say now, knowing two Apaches sat beneath her roof? Already she imagined Elias McGraw's sneer, Martha Callahan's pitying eyes. Her lips pressed tight, as though silence could keep their gossip at bay. The elder stirred then, rising with slow dignity. He approached the window, studied the snow outside, and spoke again in his language. The younger man listened, then stood, towering near the doorframe. He pulled the hatchet she had dropped in the yard, set it beside the fire, and without a word moved to the woodpile outside. Cold rushed in as he opened the door. Aurelia's hand flew to her throat, watching him disappear into the storm. Moments later, the sound of splitting wood rang through the gale, steady, precise, unbroken. Each strike landed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, filling the silence of her cabin with something new. She realized he was replenishing what she could not, that he had seen the weakness of her arms and the exhaustion in her face, and answered it not with pity but with action. When he returned, shoulders glittering with snow, he carried an armful of logs and stacked them neatly by her hearth. He said nothing, only knelt to lay one against the fire until it flamed high. Aurelia swallowed hard. Kindness, when given so plainly, cut sharper than cruelty. She wanted to demand they leave, to guard what remained of her dignity. Yet her voice refused. Instead, she sat with trembling hands while the fire's warmth grew rich enough to touch her cheeks. The elder returned to his seat with the calm of a man accustomed to storms. The younger sat near the door, watchful, silent as stone. The hours stretched long. She tried to busy herself, ladling the thin broth into 3 bowls. When she set one before each man, she half expected them to refuse. But both accepted with quiet nods. The younger tasted it without expression. The elder closed his eyes briefly, as though even meager warmth was worth gratitude. Aurelia's breath trembled as she lifted her own spoon. For the first time in years, she ate in the company of others. The sound of 3 spoons against wooden bowls felt louder than thunder. When night deepened, she found herself watching the younger man more closely. His silence was not emptiness but intention, like the silence of mountains. The firelight revealed a scar across his shoulder, pale against bronze skin, and she wondered what battles had carved it. His presence unsettled her in ways she could not name. He was unlike any man who had ever stood in her home, unyielding, foreign, and yet carrying a steadiness she longed to trust. She dozed in the chair, the blanket heavy on her lap. A sound woke her hours later, soft, measured. She blinked into the dim cabin. The elder slept, his breath slow and even. But the younger man remained awake, seated at the threshold of her door. His massive frame filled the space, outlined faintly by moonlight seeping through the storm. He sat upright, watchful, as though keeping guard not only against the storm but against the world itself. Aurelia's chest ached with a strange mixture of fear and safety. No one had kept watch for her since her husband disappeared. The sight of this stranger, silent and unmovable, stirred something she had buried beneath years of loneliness. She wanted to speak, to ask his name, but the words stayed behind her lips. Instead, she watched him until her eyelids grew heavy again. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the unwavering line of his shoulders, and the quiet promise in his stillness. Outside, the storm raged on, pressing snow higher against her cabin walls. But inside, warmth held. For the first time in countless winters, Aurelia was not entirely alone. And though fear still pulsed in her, it was softened by something she could not yet bear to call hope. When dawn finally approached, pale light seeping through the shutter cracks, Aurelia woke with the sense of being studied. She turned, heart quickening. The elder was already awake, eyes deep and measuring, as though weighing her soul. The younger man rose from the doorframe, snow still clinging to his hair, and looked at her as if he had been watching the whole night through. In that gaze lay no threat, but something heavier, a decision already made. Aurelia's breath caught, because she understood suddenly. Whatever storm awaited outside her cabin, it was not the only one she would have to face. The storm broke with the slow surrender of morning, leaving the world buried beneath a silence thick as wool. Aurelia opened her door, and stepped into light so blinding it made her eyes water. Snow rose in great drifts along the fences, roofs sagged beneath its weight, and the town road stretched ahead like a frozen scar carved through the whiteness. Behind her, the cabin smelled of firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, wood she had not split, though she could not bring herself to say it aloud. She tugged her shawl close and looked at the 2 men waiting. The elder stood with patient dignity, his dark hair streaked white, his breath curling in the air. The younger loomed beside him, bare chest steaming faintly in the cold, as though even the storm could not bite his skin. She carried a basket with the few goods she had managed, stitched gloves, patched shirts, small offerings she might trade for salt or flour. The thought of going into town made her stomach knot. Yet survival demanded it, and now, without speaking, the men followed her as if the decision had been theirs as well. The sound of boots crunching through the crusted snow marked their passage. At the town's edge, windows opened. Curtains twitched. Aurelia felt the eyes before she saw them, sharp as icicles against her back. She kept her chin low, but the whispers began almost at once, traveling faster than the wind. "That's her. Whitfield's widow. Look who walks with her, savages. Lord preserve us, she's lost all shame. Her pulse hammered. The marketplace was a cluster of wagons half buried in snow, barrels of dried beans, crates of cornmeal. Elias McGraw leaned against a post, hat tipped low, mouth curled in that cruel way of his. His voice carried like a hawk's cry. "Aurelia Whitfield," he drawled. "Looks like the rumors were true. Can't stomach life alone, so she lets wild men into her home." Laughter rippled through the cluster of townsfolk. Not all joined, but none spoke against him. Aurelia's cheeks burned. She tried to lift her basket higher, as if trade could drown the shame. Martha Callahan approached then, her hands folded against her apron, expression carved from pity. "My dear," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "you've always been proud. It's not too late to send them away before your name is ruined beyond repair." Her eyes lingered on the younger man, and she shivered as though his presence chilled her. Aurelia swallowed against the tightness in her throat. Words rose, desperate, but the weight of years alone had trained her tongue into silence. The elder met Martha's gaze without flinching, his lined face unreadable. The younger remained still, only watching the crowd with that steady dark calm, as though their barbs could not pierce him. Aurelia wondered what it meant to carry such silence like armor. She traded quickly, salt for gloves, beans for shirts, and turned to leave, but Elias stepped into her path. He was close enough that she smelled tobacco on his breath. "Be careful, widow," he said softly, though the words were meant for all to hear. "Town don't take kindly to women who forget their place. If you keep them under your roof, don't expect us to call you neighbor anymore." Her hands shook, but before she could move, the younger man shifted. His shadow fell across both of them, vast and immovable. He did not touch Elias, did not even raise his voice, but the stillness in his stance was heavier than any threat. Elias paled, lips tightening. For a heartbeat the crowd fell silent, and Aurelia felt the air change, as if the storm outside had returned in the shape of this man's quiet strength. She pushed past, heart pounding, basket clutched to her chest. The two followed her back through the snow without a word, their presence steady against the hiss of whispers left behind. Only when the cabin's roof came into view did her breath ease, though shame still burned in her ribs like fire. Inside, she slammed the basket onto the table. "You shouldn't have come," she said, voice raw. "They'll never let me live this down. Already they think me cursed, now they'll call me worse." Her eyes stung, though she would not let tears fall. The elder watched her quietly, hands folded. The younger stooped to place fresh logs on the fire, movements slow and deliberate, as if her anger could not bend his course. Her words broke against their silence. She turned away, pressing her palms to the edge of the table. "Leave. Please. You don't understand what this will cost me." Still they remained. The elder spoke then, his voice deep, carrying the weight of winters unnumbered. The words were foreign, yet something in his tone slid beneath her defenses. He gestured toward the roof, to the repaired fence posts outside, to the fire burning strong where once it had been dying. His meaning was clear even without translation. They had come not to shame her, but to give what they could. Aurelia's chest tightened until she could scarcely breathe. No one in town had lifted a hand for her in years. Yet these men, outsiders marked and mistrusted, had worked without asking, had given without demand. She pressed her hand against her mouth, caught between gratitude and the gnawing fear of what it would cost. That night, as snow fell again in soft sheets, she watched them from her chair. The younger man sharpened her hatchet with methodical strokes. The elder mended a broken chair leg with twine and patience. Small acts, simple as breath, yet each one chipped at the walls she had built around herself. Shame still whispered in her, but a new question trembled beneath it. What if kindness, even from strangers, was not a curse but a lifeline? Sleep came heavy. She dreamed of voices not raised in scorn but in song, of footsteps on her floor that did not vanish. When she woke, dawn painted the sky faint rose. She rose quietly, careful not to stir them, and stepped outside. The yard bore signs of labor, wood stacked high, fences straightened, even the roof brushed free of snow. They had worked through the night. Aurelia pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the sight. She felt both fragile and fiercely alive, caught between fear of what the town might do, and awe at what these men had already done. She turned back toward the cabin, uncertain of what she would say when they woke. But before she could step inside, a voice carried faint through the morning stillness. Elias McGraw's, drifting from the road below. If she won't rid herself of them, we'll do it for her. Aurelia froze, her breath turning white in the cold air. The words hung like a blade above her roof, and she knew the storm inside her cabin was not the last she would face. The storm returned with a vengeance, hurling itself against the cabin, as though the night were determined to break it apart. Aurelia stood by the window, watching the shadows outside bend beneath the wind. Her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl. She could not shake Elias's voice from that morning, the threat wrapped in its drawl. If she did not send the men away, the town would come for them, and for her. Behind her, the cabin glowed with the humble warmth of firelight. Tahu sat by the door, sharpening her old hatchet with steady strokes, the sound rasping like a heartbeat. His father, Nantan, leaned over a strip of hide, mending it with patient fingers. Their calmness pressed against Aurelia like a weight, as though storms were nothing new to them, as though human malice was only another season to endure. But Aurelia's chest was tight, her breath shallow. She wanted to tell them what Elias had said. She wanted to confess her fear, her shame, her dread of being cast further from a town that already treated her as an outcast. Yet her tongue would not move. To give words to her terror would be to let it root deeper. The fire crackled, throwing sparks upward. The cabin seemed smaller with them inside, every shadow magnified, every silence heavy. At last she turned, voice breaking. "They'll come," she whispered. "The men in town. They'll come for you both, for me too." Nantan lifted his gaze, his dark eyes lit with embers reflected from the fire. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her with a quiet that was not dismissive but deliberate, as though considering the weight of her words. When he finally spoke, his language carried rhythms she could not grasp, yet the timbre of his voice steadied her pulse. It was a sound not of fear but of rooted certainty, the sound of a man who had weathered worse. Tahu placed the sharpened hatchet down. He rose, his form filling the doorway, and set his hand against the frame. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath like the tide, his silence a dereliation in itself. He did not need to say he would stand if men came. His body spoke it plainly. Aurelia felt her throat ache. For years she had longed for protection, for someone to steady the weight she bore alone. Yet now, when it was offered, she recoiled with dread. If he fought, there would be blood. If he stood his ground, the town would call him a beast. And she would be their excuse. The wind screamed louder. Lanterns flickered outside the snow fog. Aurelia's heart lurched. She moved to the window and froze. Through the blur of stormlight she saw figures approaching, their forms carrying lanterns that glowed against the night like angry stars. Voices carried low, broken by wind, but sharp with intent. Elias's voice rose among them, harsh and eager. "They're here," Aurelia whispered. Her hands trembled so fiercely, she clutched the sill to keep them still. Nantan stood, placing a hand on his son's arm. Tahu's muscles tensed, then eased at his father's touch. The old man's voice murmured something low, a word shaped with gravity. Tahu inclined his head, then stepped toward the door. Aurelia's breath seized. "No, don't. If you meet them with defiance, they'll—" She broke off, her voice raw with desperation. But Tahu only glanced back at her, and in his gaze she saw no recklessness, no fury, only the same steady patience he had carried from the first moment she saw him. He opened the door. Snow swept in, whirling around his towering form, and he stepped into the night with the stillness of a mountain. Aurelia rushed to the threshold, clutching her shawl around her. The storm clawed at her hair, stung her cheeks. Before her, lanterns bobbed through the darkness, carried by men with rifles slung across their shoulders, axes in their hands. Elias led them, his mouth twisted in triumph. "There they are," Elias called. "Savages, hiding under a white woman's roof. Come to shame us all, have they? Time to drive them back where they belong." The men growled in agreement, their faces half-lit by fire and storm. Aurelia's breath caught as Tahu stepped forward, bare chest gleaming with frost, snow coiling in his long hair. He did not raise his fists, did not shout. He simply stood, silent, unmovable. The storm seemed to bow around him, as though his presence commanded even the wind. Elias faltered a step, but pride forced his voice higher. Look at him. Thinks he can frighten us with size alone. He'll learn different. Aurelia's body shook. She stepped forward before she could think, standing just behind Tahu, her shawl whipped by the gale. Her voice rose, thin but fierce. Leave us be. He has done nothing, nothing but kindness. The men stared, some with doubt, some with derision. Elias sneered. Kindness? You call it kindness when he steals your dignity? You've fallen, widow, and now you drag us all into the dirt. The words pierced her deeper than the cold. Shame seared her, but beneath it a spark flared, anger, hot and startling. She clenched her fists, her voice breaking. No. You're the ones who leave me in dirt. You sneer, you whisper, but not one of you ever lifted a hand to help. Not once. The men shifted, uneasy. Elias's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, Nanton's voice rose. It was not loud, yet it cut through the storm with clarity. He spoke in his language, words slow, heavy with command. Though Aurelia did not understand, the tone held something undeniable: warning, wisdom, the weight of years. The storm seemed to hush for a heartbeat, as though listening. Elias spat into the snow. Enough of this. Dawn comes, and we'll end it then. He turned, his lantern swinging wide, casting shadows across the drifts. The men followed, muttering, their resolve unsettled but not broken. Aurelia sagged against the doorframe, breath ragged. Tahu stood unmoved, his eyes following until the last lantern faded into the storm. Then he closed the door with quiet finality, barring it with one swift motion. Inside, the fire glowed fierce, throwing long shadows against the walls. Aurelia turned, her heart still pounding, and met Tahu's gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, heavy as the storm, fragile as breath. She understood then. This was no longer about town gossip or loneliness. It was about survival, about standing against a tide that would not relent. And she, for the first time, felt the stir of courage that was not borrowed but her own. The fire cracked, a burst of sparks leaping high. Aurelia flinched at the sound, but when she looked back at Tahu, she saw not sparks but the glimmer of something deeper in his eyes, something that frightened and steadied her all at once. And outside, though the storm raged, dawn was already pressing at the horizon, carrying with it the promise of return. The storm did not relent by morning. It thickened, as though the heavens themselves conspired to hide what was about to unfold beneath its veil. Aurelia stood at the window, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and watched the road vanish into whiteness. She had not slept. Each gust of wind had been a reminder of Elias's vow. Dawn comes and we'll end it then. The fire burned low, and though the cabin was warm, she trembled from something colder than the snow outside. Tahu rose from where he had kept watch, his broad form unfazed by the night's long vigil. His eyes met hers and she saw no fear in them, only a steadiness that reached into her bones. Nantan moved slowly, brushing frost from his cloak, his face carved with solemn knowing. Aurelia wanted to speak, to beg them not to meet violence with violence, but her tongue faltered. She realized words would not turn the river of what was coming. By mid-morning, the sound of boots broke through the storm. Lanterns bobbed in the fog, rifles gleamed faintly, and voices carried sharp against the wind. Elias led them, shoulders squared with pride, the sneer on his lips twisting into something triumphant. A dozen men followed, each holding tools meant for labor, but now sharpened for battle. The sight made Aurelia's breath seize. She clutched the doorframe as if it alone could anchor her. Tahu stepped forward and opened the door before they could knock. He stood bare-chested against the storm, the snow catching in his long black hair, his presence stark and immovable. The men faltered at the threshold of his silence, but Elias pushed past their hesitation. "There it is," he shouted. "The beast who thinks he can take what belongs to decent folk. Step aside, widow, before you're dragged down with him." Aurelia's heart thrashed in her chest. She wanted to hide, but her body betrayed her, carrying her forward until she stood just behind Tahu. She felt his heat radiating through the storm, her thin frame dwarfed by his immensity. Her voice cracked as she called out, "He has taken nothing. He saved me. You would have left me to die in the snow, but he—" Her throat tightened and she forced the words through. "He carried me home." The men shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, guilt shadowing them, but Elias's jaw hardened. He raised his rifle, not quite aiming but making the threat clear. "Kindness? That's what you call it? He's stolen your dignity, and now he'll steal your soul. We won't have it." Aurelia's knees threatened to give, but then Tahu stepped forward, his arm lifting, not to strike, but to set her behind him. He faced the rifles with unflinching calm, his chest rising slow and steady, as if their weapons were no more than winter birds. For the first time, Aurelia saw in him not only strength but restraint, a refusal to bend to fury unless forced. It was that restraint, not power, that made the men hesitate. Elias barked, "Finish it." He raised his rifle higher, finger tightening against the trigger. The storm roared louder, wind sweeping through, shaking the men as though the world itself defied them. In that split moment, Aurelia felt the future hang in balance. Blood on the snow or a stand of dignity stronger than steel. She surged past Tahu before he could stop her, standing directly in the path of Elias's aim. Her shawl whipped around her, her hair wild with snow, her voice trembling yet fierce. "Shoot me then. If it's shame you want rid of, I'll go first. But you will not lay hands on them. They are more human in silence than you are in all your noise." The words fell into the storm with a weight none could ignore. The men froze, their rifles half raised but unsteady, as if her defiance had cracked something brittle inside them. Elias's face twisted, fury warring with doubt, but his hand shook as he held the weapon. He had not expected her to stand. He had not expected her to choose. Nantan stepped forward then, his voice low but cutting through the storm with unshakable gravity. Though Aurelia could not understand his words, the tone spoke of ages, of storms faced and survived, of wisdom deeper than Elias's anger. The old man's eyes fixed on each villager in turn, and one by one their gazes fell. The rifles lowered. Shame passed among them like a contagion, leaving Elias the only one still standing tall. "You've bewitched them," Elias spat, his voice cracking. "But I won't be fooled." He lunged forward, reaching to seize Aurelia's arm. In a breath, Tahu moved. His hand caught Elias's wrist with crushing force, yanking him back. For the first time his silence broke, not in words, but in a sound raw and primal, a growl born from years of restraint snapping. He threw Elias to the snow, not with brutality but with finality, a gesture that said enough. Elias sprawled, his rifle lost to the drift, his pride shattered in the hush of his followers' stares. The men looked at one another, then at Aurelia, and at the giant who stood guard over her. None stepped forward. Shame pulled them back until only Elias remained on the ground, his threats dissolved in the storm's howl. He scrambled to his feet, eyes burning with humiliation, but when they met Aurelia's gaze, his fury faltered. She stood tall despite trembling, her hand resting against Tahu's arm as though to show the town that her choice was not made in fear. At last Elias turned, retreating into the whiteness, his shadow swallowed by snow. One by one, the others followed, until the storm carried them all away. Silence returned, broken only by Aurelia's ragged breath. She sagged, her strength nearly spent. But Tahu's arm was there, steady beneath her hand. He turned his face toward her, the storm softening around them. His voice came low, deep as earth, words shaped slowly in English though thick with accent. "You'll never be alone again." Aurelia's heart surged against her ribs. For years she had prayed for belonging, for protection, for a place unbroken by shame. Now it stood before her, not in grand deaureliations but in quiet presence, in the strength of two men who had asked nothing and given everything. She lifted her eyes, and though tears blurred them, the storm beyond seemed less merciless, the world less hollow. Behind them, the fire still burned, aglow against the snow, steady and defiant. Aurelia stepped back into the cabin with them, not as one shamed, but as one chosen. And though the storm would rise again, she knew that from this day forward, she would face it not as a ghost in her own house, but as a woman no longer alone.